"You're nothing but a failure," my mother's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. The words stung, not just because they were harsh, but because they were spoken with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for rebuttal. I froze, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. This was supposed to be a family dinner, a night to celebrate my accomplishments, but instead, it felt like a moment of complete betrayal. I'm Amanda Carson, 31 years old, and this was the moment I realized that no matter what I did, it would never be enough for my parents. Ever since I was a child, I've worked hard to meet their expectations. I was the quiet, obedient daughter, the one who always strived to do the right thing, always eager to prove myself. But tonight, it seemed like all of that was meaningless. My father sat there silently, his eyes avoiding mine as my mother's words echoed in the room. "You failed in every way that matters," she added, her voice laced with frustration. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, but instead, I just sat there, fighting back tears. All my life, I had been told that success was the only thing that mattered, that I would never be truly valued unless I achieved something significant. And yet, no matter how many late nights I spent studying, how many sacrifices I made to get into a good school, and how hard I worked to build a future for myself, it still wasn't enough. The weight of their disappointment was unbearable. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, but it was like no one even saw me. My accomplishments, my dreams, everything I had worked so hard for, seemed irrelevant to them. The quiet laughter of my younger brother, who had always been the golden child, only made the sting worse. But I wasn't about to let this define me. No, I couldn't. I wasn't going to be crushed by their words. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a deliberate motion. "I'll show you," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I will prove that I'm not a failure." I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let my parents' judgment dictate my future. As I walked away from the table, I felt a strange sense of resolve building inside me. This was far from over, and the story was just beginning. The next few days felt like a blur. I could still hear my mother's words echoing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The only thing I could focus on was proving her wrong. I spent the entire week buried in my studies. I skipped dinners, ignored calls from friends, and canceled plans. I didn't have time for distractions. Every night, I sat at my desk, the glow of the lamp illuminating the stacks of textbooks and papers scattered across the surface. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but I couldn't afford to stop. This was my chance to show them. This was my chance to finally prove that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. By the time the week came to a close, I had completed every assignment, studied for every exam, and even attended a few extra seminars. My mind was exhausted, but there was a part of me that felt alive, determined. That Saturday, the dean of the university announced a special scholarship for a student who had demonstrated exceptional academic achievement. I wasn't expecting much. I didn't even consider myself a candidate. But I attended the ceremony anyway, sitting in the back of the auditorium, hoping to gather some inspiration. When the dean finally took the stage, his voice echoed through the room, and I felt the excitement building. And now, the student who has shown the most promise in their field, who has gone above and beyond in their studies, is Amanda Carson. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up in shock, every single eye in the room turning to me. The applause that followed was deafening, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. I walked up to the stage, trying to keep my composure, but inside, I was trembling. When I took the certificate from the dean, it felt heavier than I had imagined. As I looked out into the crowd, I saw my parents sitting there, their faces frozen in surprise. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly won. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever doubted me. I smiled, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling my chest. This was the moment I had been waiting for, my victory, my moment to finally stand tall. The next few days felt surreal. The applause at the ceremony had barely faded, but the reality of my achievement was sinking in. As I walked back to my seat, I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on me, and for once, it wasn't filled with judgment or disappointment. It was respect. It was recognition. But nothing compared to the moment I would face later that evening when I walked into my parents' house. My hands were still shaking as I reached for the door handle. The scholarship was in my hand, but it felt like something even more powerful had been handed to me, the validation I had longed for. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home greeting me, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. My parents were seated at the dining table, as usual, their eyes not yet meeting mine. I had not even been sure if they would show up at the ceremony, but they had. A part of me had hoped they would be proud, but another part of me feared they wouldn't acknowledge it. My mother glanced up first, and the silence between us felt suffocating. She was the first to speak. "You really did it, didn't you?" Her voice was soft, but I could hear the surprise behind it. "Yes, I did," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. I could feel her eyes studying me, and for the first time, it felt like she was actually seeing me, seeing who I had become, not just who she had wanted me to be. My father remained silent, his face unreadable. I walked over to the table, sitting down across from them. For a long moment, none of us said anything. It was as if we were all processing the same thing, the shift that had occurred. Finally, my father spoke, his voice quieter than I expected. "We never thought you had it in you," he said, his words cutting through the stillness. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I didn't let it show. "I didn't need you to," I replied, my voice calm. "I did this for me, not for you." The silence that followed was thick, but there was something in the air now. Something different. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was realization. I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing. For the first time, I felt like I had taken control of my life. I had done something for myself, and no matter what anyone thought, that was enough. The following weeks felt like a delicate balance between old wounds and new beginnings. The scholarship had opened doors, but it also left a strange emptiness in its wake. I could feel my parents' presence in the house, but it was different now. There was an unspoken understanding, something that wasn't quite resolved, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. One evening, I sat on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against my face as I reflected on everything that had happened. My parents were inside, talking, their voices muffled, but I could hear snippets of their conversation. "She actually did it," my mother's voice sounded almost in disbelief. "Maybe we were too hard on her," my father added quietly. I couldn't help but wonder if they were starting to understand me, if they were finally seeing that I had a life of my own, separate from their expectations. It wasn't easy, and I wasn't sure if they truly felt the weight of what I had achieved, but I was learning to let go of the need for their approval. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the scholarship certificate resting on my desk, I realized something important. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet their standards, but now I had found my own path. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The next day, I received a letter. It was an invitation to an internship program that would allow me to work closely with leaders in my field, and the moment I read it, I knew it was the next step. This was no longer just about proving my parents wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of shaping my own future, that my dreams were valid, and that my worth wasn't defined by anyone else. I smiled to myself as I thought about the future, about where this journey would take me. I wasn't sure what would come next, but I was ready. I had spent too long doubting myself, but now I was ready to embrace every challenge ahead. The internship was everything I had hoped for and more. It wasn't just a learning experience. It was a chance to prove that I was capable of standing alongside people who were once so far ahead of me. I threw myself into the work, absorbing everything I could, staying late, pushing my limits. But the more I immersed myself in the field, the more I realized that this journey wasn't just about proving something to my parents or anyone else. It was about me finding my own identity, my own worth, and my own place in the world. I was no longer the girl who was waiting for approval or the one who was constantly compared to others. I was becoming someone else, someone who didn't need validation, but rather created her own path. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a report I had spent hours putting together, I received a call from home. I hesitated for a moment before picking up. It was my mother. "Amanda, we need to talk," she said, her voice softer than usual. I could hear the uncertainty in her tone. My heart raced as I braced myself for the conversation that had been looming for weeks. "I've been thinking about everything," she continued. "About how we treated you. About how we always pushed you, expecting more than you were ready for. We were wrong." I sat in silence for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. It wasn't the apology I had been waiting for, but it was something more. It was recognition. "I'm sorry," she added, her voice tinged with regret. "I should have supported you more. You've done more than we ever gave you credit for." I felt a lump form in my throat. It wasn't easy hearing those words, but it was a step. It was a step toward healing, toward understanding. For years, I had tried to meet their expectations, and now, finally, they were seeing me for who I truly was. "Thank you," I said quietly, not knowing if she could hear the depth of my emotion, but needing her to know that her words mattered. "I'm doing this for me," I continued, my voice steady, "and I don't need anyone's approval to know that I am enough." After a long pause, she spoke again, this time with a softness that I hadn't heard in years. "We're proud of you, Amanda. I hope you know that." It wasn't the fairy tale ending I had imagined, but it was real. And that, in itself, was enough. The months that followed were filled with new opportunities, but they were also a time of quiet reflection. The internship had become a pivotal moment in my life, but the hardest part was still navigating the delicate relationship with my parents. It wasn't that I expected them to suddenly become my biggest supporters, but their acknowledgment of my achievements had opened a door I never thought would be possible. I didn't know what would come next, but I felt ready for whatever challenges awaited me. The pressure I once felt to meet their expectations started to fade. Instead of feeling like I was constantly trying to prove myself, I began to find my own rhythm. I started making decisions for myself, decisions that were based on what I wanted, not on what others thought I should do. One evening, while I was working late on a project, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It was simple, just a few words, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. "I'm proud of you, Amanda. I hope you know that." Those words, after everything, meant more than I could express. It wasn't the kind of praise I had been waiting for, but it was enough. It was real. The following week, I was invited to speak at a local event about my journey. It wasn't something I had ever imagined myself doing, but it felt right. I had learned so much over the past months, and I wanted to share that with others who might be feeling the same way I had, lost, unsure, and constantly trying to meet someone else's standards. As I stood in front of the crowd, I could feel the nervousness in my stomach, but I knew this was my moment to speak my truth. "I've spent most of my life trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be," I said, my voice steady. "But I've learned that I am enough, just as I am. You don't need anyone's approval to be proud of yourself." The applause that followed wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who had ever felt overlooked, for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. And in that moment, I realized that the journey wasn't about winning over anyone else. It was about winning for myself. That was the true victory. The day after the event, I woke up feeling a sense of calm that I had never known before. It wasn't just the applause or the recognition that lingered with me, it was the feeling of finally embracing who I was, of owning my accomplishments without needing anyone's approval. I spent the morning at a local cafe, reflecting on the past few months. The hustle of work, the late nights, the constant drive to prove myself, it all felt so far behind me now. I had discovered something far more important: peace. I had learned to let go of the expectations I had carried with me for years. I was no longer burdened by the weight of trying to live up to a standard that wasn't even mine. The journey had been tough, but in the end, it had been worth it. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and I wasn't sure what to expect. "Amanda," she said when I answered, her voice sounding different than before, softer, almost tentative. "I've been thinking about everything you've been doing. About the work, the scholarship, the speaking event. I'm proud of you, you know that." Her words caught me off guard, even though I had been waiting for something like this. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, and it was a moment I had never thought would come. It wasn't just an apology, but an acknowledgment of my growth, of who I had become. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It means a lot to me. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation lighter than it had ever been. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my mother truly saw me. Not as the daughter she had hoped I would be, but as the woman I had become. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair, the weight of it all settling in. This was what I had been waiting for, not just their approval, but the peace that came with knowing that I could stand on my own. I had built a life that was mine, a life that no one could take away. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't need to be defined by my past or by anyone else's expectations. I was enough. I always had been. The weeks following my conversation with my mother felt like a turning point in my life. I had achieved so much, but more importantly, I had found a sense of peace and confidence that I had never known before. I no longer felt the need to constantly prove myself, especially to people who had once seemed like the ultimate judges of my worth. I continued to thrive in my internship, taking on new challenges with a sense of purpose that I hadn't had before. I was starting to believe in myself more than I ever had. My parents, though they still didn't fully understand everything I had done or where I was headed, began to treat me differently. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. My father, who had been so silent for most of my life, surprised me one evening with a simple comment. We were sitting in the living room, just the two of us, and for the first time, it didn't feel strained. "You've really changed, Amanda," he said, his voice soft. "I'm starting to see the woman you've become." It wasn't the grand recognition I had once dreamed of, but it was enough. In that moment, I realized that it wasn't about waiting for their approval. It was about building a life that I was proud of, regardless of whether they saw it or not. My relationships with my parents slowly improved, but I knew that I couldn't depend on them for my happiness or validation anymore. I had found my own path, one that was uniquely mine. One day, as I walked down the street near my apartment, I passed a bookstore that had a sign in the window advertising a writing contest. I had always loved writing, but I had never considered it seriously. Yet, something inside me stirred as I looked at the sign. Maybe this was another challenge I could take on, another way to prove to myself that I could succeed. I signed up for the contest, and though I didn't win, the experience taught me something vital, that I was capable of trying new things, stepping outside of my comfort zone, and continuing to grow. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about embracing the journey, learning from each experience, and understanding that I was enough. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free to be myself, free to chase my own dreams, and free to let go of the past. As time passed, the pressure that had once felt suffocating began to lift. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. My days were filled with purpose, and for the first time in my life, I could feel my own sense of identity taking root. No longer defined by others' expectations, I started to realize how much I had neglected myself in the pursuit of approval. I began to reconnect with old friends, people I had once distanced myself from because I was so focused on meeting goals set by others. It was refreshing to laugh, without the weight of guilt, to be myself without any fear of judgment. I remember one evening, a quiet moment with a friend I had known since childhood. We sat in a coffee shop, reminiscing about the old days, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to accomplishments or titles. We talked about everything and nothing, and I realized how much I had missed these simple moments. My friend looked at me and said, "You know, you've really changed. You seem different now, more confident, more yourself." I smiled, feeling a quiet pride. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming who I always was, underneath all the layers I had built up over the years. That night, I reflected on my journey. The internship, the scholarship, the writing contest, they were all milestones, but they were only part of the bigger picture. The most important change had happened within me. I had learned to trust myself, to honor my own dreams, and to stop measuring my worth by anyone else's standards. For the first time, I felt free to make decisions based on what was best for me. A few months later, I made the bold decision to apply for a full-time position at the company I had been interning with. It wasn't a sure thing, but I knew it was the right move. When I received the job offer, it felt like a confirmation of everything I had worked for. It wasn't just about a career, It was a recognition of my growth, my persistence, and my belief in myself. I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. I had found my voice, my strength, and my place in this world. And as I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I couldn't help but smile. This was only the beginning. As the months went on, I found myself increasingly comfortable with the decisions I had made. The job I had worked so hard for felt like a natural fit, and I began to feel like I was truly in control of my life. But there were still moments when I found myself questioning whether I had really changed or if I was just pretending. Those doubts came and went, but I had learned how to push them aside, reminding myself that I was the one driving my future now, not anyone else. One evening, I was sitting in the living room after work, scrolling through emails when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. I hadn't heard from her in a few weeks, and I didn't expect much from the message. "I saw you at the company event today. You looked happy. I'm proud of you." The words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't the loud, dramatic apology I had once dreamed of, but it was genuine. It wasn't about her accepting everything I had done, but it was a small step in the right direction. It was the first time in my life that I realized I didn't need her approval to feel good about my accomplishments. I was proud of myself. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, reflecting on how far I had come. The path had not been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but I had finally accepted that I didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. My parents, my past, none of that defined me anymore. What defined me was my ability to keep going, to keep striving for more, and to believe in myself. That moment of clarity was something I had been searching for my whole life, and now, for the first time, I felt at peace with it. I had learned that it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, the growth, and the realization that I was enough. And as the days went by, I felt a sense of freedom that I had never known before, freedom to be myself, to live on my terms, and to embrace the future with open arms. As I continued to settle into this new version of myself, I began to realize that the true transformation wasn't just in the career I had built or the recognition I had received. It was in the way I viewed myself, how I had finally learned to appreciate my own worth without waiting for validation from anyone else. I was no longer that person who tried to mold herself into something her parents wanted or anyone else expected. I was, for the first time, living life for myself. It was empowering to walk into meetings with confidence, to know that I had earned my place, and to see that others respected me for who I was, not for who they thought I should be. One afternoon, as I was working from home, my phone rang. It was my father. I hadn't heard from him much, so when I saw his name on the screen, I hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Amanda, I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you," he said, his voice steady. I could tell he meant it. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything. After all these years, after all the expectations, the pressure, and the distance, it felt like he finally saw me, not as a daughter trying to meet his standards, but as someone who had found her own path. "Thanks, Dad," I said, my voice soft. "That means more than you know." We didn't say much more, but the simplicity of those words, just the acknowledgement of my hard work, was enough to fill a space I had once thought would never be filled. After the call, I sat back and thought about everything that had led me here. The journey, the setbacks, the doubts, and the quiet moments of triumph that no one saw but me. It was all part of the bigger picture. And for the first time in my life, I could see it clearly. I was becoming the person I had always wanted to be. It wasn't a perfect journey, and it wasn't a straight path, but it was mine. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The months continued to unfold, each day bringing me closer to the person I had always hoped to become. With every step forward, I became more confident, more certain of my abilities. The weight of my parents' expectations, though still there, didn't burden me the way it once had. I realized that their approval, while meaningful, was no longer what defined my success. I had started to define that for myself. The job I had worked so hard for became a place where I could grow, where my voice mattered. But beyond the career milestones, something more profound was happening. I was building the life I wanted. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but I was learning to embrace those moments too. The challenges weren't roadblocks. They were just parts of the journey. I spent more time with friends, rekindling relationships I had neglected for years. We shared laughter, and in those quiet moments, I realized how much I had missed truly living. One evening, I found myself sitting on my balcony, a warm cup of tea in my hands, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about the next goal, the next achievement. I was just present, soaking in the peace of the moment. The life I had built was mine, and it wasn't defined by anyone else. I had created something unique, something that fulfilled me in ways I never thought possible. As the seasons changed, I kept pushing forward, continuing to grow in ways that I couldn't have imagined years ago. But what stood out the most was how much I had learned to trust myself. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. It wasn't about living up to someone else's expectations, it was about finding happiness on my own terms. And as I looked ahead, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. I had spent so many years doubting myself, but now I was confident in my abilities. I was ready to face whatever challenges came my way, knowing that I had the strength to overcome them. This was my life, my journey, and for the first time, I was truly free.